Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for another edition of Texas Insider TV brought to you by Speedstream. I'm Jim Cardle. Robert Talton is a former state legislator running for the Chief Justice slot of the Texas Supreme Court. A former state legislator who was in his last term named the most conservative member of the Texas House of Representatives. What is it going to take to knock off a 24-year incumbent? We're pleased to be able to visit with Robert Talton for Supreme Court Justice today. Robert, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, Jim. Good to see you again.
You and I have known each other for years, going back to your, as I mentioned, stellar days as a conservative in the Texas House of Representatives, and now you are running for Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, a tall order. A lot of folks say that after 24 years as a Chief Justice and an appointee by Governor Perry, it may be time for a change. But I need to ask the typical question, and that is, what do you think differentiates you from the sitting justice, and what are your qualifications, if you would?
Jim, there's several things that separate me from the present Chief Justice. Number one, I didn't serve 24 years in the legislature. Number two, I haven't overturned 74% of the jury trials that this Supreme Court has reviewed. It is important to me, and one of the reasons why I ran is that I will leave a fair, impartial, and independent judiciary that respects the trial by jury, rule of law, and our Constitution.
You have said during your campaign that you do not believe in judicial activism. I want to get into some of the judicial particulars in questions in a minute. But first, let me ask, you were a front runner ahead of your time during your legislative days, and it's still a big issue for voters across Texas with amnesty in the news, President Obama, but you had some efforts to address sanctuary cities that I think is relevant to a judicial office. Tell us about your thoughts on sanctuary cities and our immigration problem, what you view that situation today.
Jim, as you know, I was a policeman in Pasadena for almost 3 years, and we always were able to ask what an immigration status of a person that may not have a driver's license or whatever. And so in my last session in 2007, I filed a bill that was a criminal penalties regarding sanctuary cities, because I felt like that a policeman ought to be able to ask that question. Are you a citizen? And show me some documentation if you are.
Okay. So
that's what I did, and it was probably, if I remember right, probably one of the first sanctuary city bills that was filed.
And still to this day, we're fighting that fight, I guess.
We are. We have not yet. Houston, as you know, is a sanctuary city. Mm-hmm. And I know the city where I live, Pasadena, is not. The policeman there can ask that. There's no reason why the largest police department in the state can't ask that question, but they can't. Mm-hmm. They would be violating their rules. And so that's what happens. And they need statutes. Statutes will overrule any city ordinance or city rule.
And during your time as a legislator, you were a member, vice chairman of the Civil Practices and Criminal Jurisprudence Committee. A lot of our viewers will know about the Texas Supreme Court, but tell us, if you would, there are particular constitutional requirements. What are some of the basic necessities someone has to qualify to be a Supreme Court justice?
Right. To be a Supreme Court justice, our Constitution sets out that you have to have practiced law for 10 years. You have to be 35 years of age. You have to be a resident of the state and a citizen of the United States. That's the basic qualifications that a person has to have to be able to do that. Fortunately, I have several others that others don't have. One, I've been in the executive branch as a policeman. Number two, I've been in the legislative branch, so I understand what it means when they ask the question, what did the legislature mean? I know what that intent is because I helped write those laws. My last two sessions was on civil practice and remedy, and we reviewed many of the statutes.
Speaking of some of those particulars and operations within the Supreme Court and your experience on the legislative intent, Texas used to be known as a state where attorneys could shop the venue. We've overcome that. the economy is strong as a result, many analysts say. But talk about, if you would, Robert, the idea that the current court has maybe gone too far, or what are you seeing in your candidacy that needs to be changed to the direction of the Supreme Court, perhaps?
Well, as I said earlier, we need a court that's fair and impartial, not one that is skewed toward what I call the crony capitalism or crony corporations that are looking for, or the special interests that are looking for an advantage over an individual or a small business person. And that's what I see happening now. There was a study that was done with 650 of these cases over a 10-year period.
Okay.
And they found that 74% of the jury trials that were reviewed by the Supreme Court were reversed. And I think it ought to be rare to overturn a jury verdict.
So you're talking about jury trials, and we could get into this in a second. There's a lot of discussion about whether Texas should change its current system from judges being elected to appointed. But local elections can be a good thing. Local juries are operating under a system run by locally elected judges. Is that something that leads to a fair trial coming up to the Supreme Court, and then there's a reversal, or is this a direction the Supreme Court may be going against what voters understand?
I think that's what's happened, is they're going against what voters understand. Voters vote on their district judges, and those that serve on juries are the voters. Okay. And then those cases, if they appeal, they'll go to Court of Appeals, and most of them are conservative courts. They're Republican courts. And so that's what's going on. They're overturning those people. Now, you ask about the appointed or elected. Mm-hmm. When I was in the legislature, they tried several times to do the appointment. I don't want a blue ribbon panel appointing the judges. I think people ought to be able to elect the judges. I think it's a freedom issue.
Mm-hmm. A lot of folks across Texas, I think, will appreciate your perspective on that. Being elected can be a very good thing in terms of citizen engagement.
Right, that's correct. And I'm concerned because what I have seen, at least I believe, I want to say 7 of the current ones were appointed that's on the Supreme Court, and only a few of them haven't been elected. So they get appointed as a justice, and then as appointment they run as an incumbent, and then they get the money, and then it's hard for anybody that challenges them to defeat them because they've got the money, they've got the endorsements, and they're the incumbent.
Before I get into particulars on the campaign trail, I want to thank you all for viewing. Again, we're visiting with former House member Robert Talton from House District 144 out of Pasadena, now running against Nathan Hecht for Supreme Court Justice in the Texas Supreme Court. Robert, talk about on the campaign trail, there's a lot of focus on judicial races this year, probably more so than in a typical election year. And there's also a lot of angst amongst Tea Party members, truly conservative Texans, whether or not that reflects the overall Texas populace is what elections are for. But talk about, if you would, what you're hearing on the campaign trail. Do you see Tea Party engagement with an effort on the Supreme Court? Is it something that folks are watching? And if so, what issues in particular do they care about the most, do you think?
Well, I think the Tea Parties are. I think this time they're much more in tune with judicial, because judicial, many people don't look at them, but they're looking at it more because, they understand the governor, lieutenant governor, and the others. But in the judicial, they understand that the judges have the final say when it comes to courts. And so obviously what they want the courts to be of people, and they want people who are going to interpret the law and respect our Constitution and respect our statutes. And I don't think that's what's been going on, and that's what they're looking for, is people who will do that. I've got a history of doing that, and that's what I've done, and that's what I pledge to do if I'm elected as Chief Justice.
And one final question, talking about what folks expect. Every now and then comes up the issue of, in Texas at least, appointed versus elected judges. Maybe should there be term limits? Is that something you've got a position in particular on, or that you hear about?
Well, people talk about the term limits. As you know, we don't have that, but I actually carried a 12-year term limit bill early in my career, and I think 12 years is plenty for anybody to do. That gives you a time to learn the system and to be a part of it, and then you can pass it on to someone else. You're not the only one that can do this job. Others can do that. And so if you have about 12 years, then you don't leave it for the bureaucrats to run everything as it is done up in the U.S. Government.
Well, speaking of limits, we're going to limit this interview in respect for your time. Candidate Robert Talton for Supreme Court Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, we appreciate you coming in.
Thank you, Jim.
And folks, be sure and watch for future editions of Texas Insider TV, brought to you by SpeedStream. We're glad to have had Robert Talton in to talk about the Texas Supreme Court today. Remember, you're either an insider or you're not. I'm Jim Cardle. Thanks for watching.